Well, good morning. I spend a lot of time teaching preschoolers and teenagers. I don't spend a lot of time talking to big people, so this is new. Um, but yeah, like my dad was saying, I'm in Central Arkansas, so I don't get to be here as often as I'd like. But this church does have a very special place in my heart, and I'm genuinely so thankful for the opportunity to speak to you guys today. So just to start off, um, just a question, just by a show of hands, who here genuinely likes having to wait for things? That's what I thought. I don't either. I'm pretty impatient. And I think it's a fair statement to say that we've become that way kind of as a society as a whole. We have a bit of an impatient culture. We want things to be fast and efficient. We've moved to this place in society where we have new devices like a microwave that's supposed to make your food preparation a little bit faster. We have text messages because a letter or an email or even just a phone call takes up too much of our time. Times are changing, and life today is significantly more fast-paced than I would say it's ever been. Simply stated, we don't like waiting for things. I have nothing against these new ideas, these new concepts, and this vision for the world and the way that it's changing. I don't have anything against it because, honestly, if there's a way to make things easier and faster, then why not do it? It's made my life a lot easier. I am very thankful for some of the things that we have today that they didn't have in the olden days. But I do see an issue with it, and the main issue I have is that there's been a sort of shift in our mindsets where we are becoming so accustomed to this sort of instant gratification that we don't know how to be patient and wait for things to happen. And unfortunately, as Christians, God does require us to wait for things fairly often. He may give us some promises, or he may reveal things to us that he wants to do in our lives, but he requires us to wait for those things to come to pass. He may give us dreams and hopes and visions for things for our life, but they may take a little bit longer to accomplish than maybe we would like them to. We may even be in some sort of sticky situation that it seems like we're stuck in forever. It seems like it just goes on, and it's just because we're so impatient. We can't wait to get out of that season of our lives, even though that may be where the Lord wants us in that moment. Recently, God's been dealing with me a lot in this area, just waiting on him to do what he wants to do in my life in his own timing. Over the last 2 or 3 years, God has really been showing me things that he wants to do in my life, things that he wants to do through me. And those things are so exciting. They're things that I'm thrilled about, but waiting for those things to actually happen has been just painful sometimes because it seems like it's never ending, just the waiting. It's been far too easy for me to slip into this place of frustration and especially of doubt about the things that God has said he's going to do in my life. It's really easy for me to think, what was God even thinking whenever he gave me this desire? And well, if it's not happening, maybe it wasn't actually from him in the first place, which is so far from the truth. It's the thought that comes to mind with me whenever I have gotten used to this lifestyle of everything now, right away. It's immediate. But as I find myself in these moments of having to wait and of getting a little bit discouraged about it and maybe doubtful, the Lord sort of reminds me of Abraham, because I think he's kind of the poster child for having to wait on God's promises. His story's kind of a long one, so I'm not going to read all of it, but we are going to focus on, we are going to focus on some of the bigger points in his life. So first of all, God made Abraham, who at the time was called Abram, a promise. He actually made Abram a few different promises, but essentially they all tie into one big promise. And we see these promises made in Genesis 12, 15, and 17. In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, It says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you.'" Then later in Genesis 15, 1 through 5, it says, "After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward.' But Abram said, 'Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?' And Abram said, 'You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir.' Then the word of the Lord came to him, 'This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir.' He took him outside and said, 'Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.'" And finally in Genesis 17, verses 1 through 8, it says, "When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, 'I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers.' Abram fell face down, and God said to him, 'As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God." So essentially, God promised Abraham that he would be the father of a great nation of people for generations to come. And I think whenever God made those promises to Abraham, he must have been so excited. But then I remember, well, God's made me promises, and I was excited, but then I start to doubt them. And so did Abraham. The waiting period came after God made those promises. But there were a few things that Abraham did that I feel like we can take away and we can do when we find ourselves waiting for God to sort of make things happen in our lives. The first thing that I feel like we need to do is be patient, which again is just really difficult to do in this day and time. But I think about baking. I like to bake. I've recently discovered I'm actually pretty good at baking. As long as I'm asked to bake cookies and nothing else ever. But baking is a real test of my patience. You spend all that time mixing together the right ingredients and the right amounts, and you finally have it in the oven, but then you just have to sit and wait. You can smell your cookies as they start to get done, and you can even kind of see them sometimes if you've got the little window, and you might sit there and stare at your cookies and think, are they done yet? And they may actually look like they're probably done enough to eat, but if you take them out before they're ready, you might seriously regret it. And that's kind of how it is with waiting on God. His timing will always be right, even if to us it looks like, okay, this is done, it's time for it to happen. If it's not God's timing, we may regret it. It's in Genesis 21 that we actually start to see God's promise coming to pass for Abraham finally. In 21 verses 1 through 5, it says, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him." He was 100 years old when his son was finally born. And God first made him the promise that he would be a father of great nations, but just that he would be a father alone when he was 75 years old. He had to wait 25 years for God's promise to actually start to take shape in his life. And I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. In fact, he actually tried to take matters into his own hands to try and speed up God's timeline a little bit. In Genesis 16, where it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. It's way too easy today to give in when we see a sort of shortcut in life. It could happen when you're baking and you think to yourself, well, if I just turned up the temperature on the oven a little bit, I bet these would bake a little faster. And yes, in theory, your cookies will be done faster, but they probably won't be nearly as good as they would have been had you just followed the directions. Abram found himself in that same situation. He saw a shortcut, and he tried to give God a hand. And yes, he saw results. He was given a son, even in his old age, but the results were not what God had intended for him. Those many generations that Abraham was supposed to be a father of were not supposed to come from his son Ishmael, who came from Hagar. They were supposed to come through him and Sarah. It seems to have done more harm than good, honestly. And I know that I'm guilty of that same thing in my life. I get tired of waiting for things to happen, so I may try to make them happen on my own. I try to help God out a little bit. But as I think about it, that sounds so ridiculous. Us helping God out. God doesn't need our help. He's God. He just wants us to be patient and wait for him to fulfill things in his own timing. And the second thing that I noticed in the life of Abraham is that in our waiting period, it is important to be obedient. God didn't just make promises to Abraham. A promise can easily be one-sided. You can make a promise to a friend that requires them to do nothing but just remember the promise, essentially. But God didn't just make a promise, he made a covenant. He made a contract with Abraham that required action of him. He told Abraham to be faithful and to do certain things. First, God told him to move. He told him to leave his home, leave everything that he knew, and go to a new land that God would give him, to be a foreigner. He also commanded Abraham to circumcise every male as a sign of the covenant they had made, and said that if any male did not do so, he would have broken the covenant and be cut off from his people. So Abraham did all of the things that were asked of him because he had a covenant with God. Sometimes the things that God asks of us don't really make sense to us. Some of you guys know a couple of summers ago, the Lord told me to go to Africa. And I love missions, and I love helping people, but I know that I am not called to go be a missionary in a foreign country. I like things to be comfortable. I like to stay in my comfort zone. And if you would ask me 2 or 3 years ago if I thought that going camping in the African bush for a month sounded fun, I probably would have been hesitant, to say the least. So when God told me to do just that, to go to Africa for a month and live there in close quarters with 12 other people, it didn't really make sense to me. I knew that there would be a lot of stress that I would have to deal with leading up to it, which I don't deal well with stress. And I had to spend money that I didn't really have. I had to raise this money in a short amount of time. I didn't see how it was possible. I didn't really understand why. It didn't make sense to me. I had to get like 4 shots, and as if it isn't bad enough that I hate needles. I don't do well with them at all. One of my shots had to be administered in Africa. And you might think I'm crazy. Probably not. But the idea of having someone stick a needle in my arm in a foreign country is not thrilling to me. I had to leave my friends and my family and my home and essentially everything that I knew and go through this major culture shift, and it just didn't make sense to me. I honestly didn't understand why God told me to do it, but I was obedient. I did it because I trusted that even though it doesn't make sense to me, he probably has some plan in mind. But today, I wouldn't ever think about regretting the things that I went through to make that trip happen, because it was uncomfortable and there were trying times, but it was one of the most incredible experiences that I've ever had, and the Lord knew that going into it, even though I didn't. I was obedient to God because I trusted him. I trusted that he had a plan. Which brings me to the third thing that we should do when we wait on God to make things happen in our lives. We should trust God. His plans are greater than ours. Abraham had to trust God immensely in this whole season, but especially in this last season, because even after God fulfilled his promise that he would have a son, God tested him in that. In Genesis 22, it says, "Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.'" And then a little later in the chapter, it says, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." I think that line, that final verse, really sums up the attitude of trust that we should have with God, the way that Abraham did. Abraham knew that God had asked him to sacrifice his son that he waited so long for, and he went so far as to take his son up the mountain to actually complete the sacrifice that God had asked of him. But he trusted that there was a plan in all of it. He even, not in the passage that I read, but in some of the other translations that I read, it said that Abraham even told his servants, "Wait here, we're going to go up and worship, and then the boy and I will return to you." Because he had enough faith to know that the Lord is going to fulfill my promise that he gave me, that many nations will come through my son Isaac. So he has some plan here, even if I don't know what it is, and I trust him in that. I don't know what he thought would happen, honestly. We aren't really told that much. I don't know if Abraham thought that God would stop him before he sacrificed his son, or if he believed that God would raise his son from the dead, or if he believed that God would provide some sort of animal in place of his son. But regardless of what his thoughts were, he displayed so much trust in God. God had promised that he would be the father of a great nation through Isaac. He trusted God in a way that I would like to say that I could have, but I honestly don't know. I struggle to trust God with things that are so much smaller than that. I struggle to trust God with my grades. And Abraham's here trusting God with the life of his son. But when you're waiting on God to make things happen in your life, it's important to have that sort of trust. It can be so easy to feel hopeless or to feel like you're drowning in this situation. Even if you're being obedient and even if you're being patient, you can still feel very discouraged about it if you don't have that trust in the Lord. Now, it's really easy to say those words, to say, "I'll trust God, I'll be patient, I'll obey him." It's much easier said than done. Honestly, it just seems so hard to do those things sometimes. How, in the middle of your frustration and your doubt, how can you trust God to come through? Not only how, but why should you even do it? Why should I, when I'm struggling with this and it seems like it's never ending, why should I believe that God's going to do something in my life? It's really simple, honestly. We can trust him and we can be patient and we can be obedient with him because our God is faithful every time. God fulfills the promises he makes. God gave Abraham a son. Although he tested Abraham, he did not take away that son. Abraham never fully got to see God's promise fulfilled, but that was always the plan. There would be generations to come after him. Regardless of whether or not he lived to see it come to pass, God's promises were fulfilled. God was faithful to Abraham. We actually see in Matthew 1:17, far after Abraham is ever living on the earth, it says, "Thus there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah." Abraham's lineage was the one of David, who slayed the giant, and David, who was this mighty king who had this, even though he fell, he had this deep relationship with the Lord through a lot of the Bible. David, who even people who don't really know about the Bible and don't really know about our beliefs, they recognize the name David. And not only David, but this lineage was the one of Jesus. Jesus, who was maybe not a king in the literal sense. He didn't come sit on the earth and wear a crown and rule over people, but he's in my opinion, the greatest king. God promised that Abraham would be the father of a great nation of people, that great kings and great generations would come from him. And it's quite clear to me that he followed through on his promise to Abraham. Our God is faithful all of the time. He will come through, even if it's not in our time, even if it doesn't make sense to us. God is faithful to come through every single time. It may require that we have a sort of patience that seems painful and endless. It may require that we take action. We do something that scares us or that doesn't make sense to us simply because the Lord directed us to do so. It may require us to put more trust in God than we could even imagine. But I know in my life, I serve a God who has come through for me every single time. He's brought me out of every mess or situation that I've found myself in, and he makes every dream that he gives me, every desire that he gives me, he makes it a reality. And it's my hope that you will all see him do that same thing in your lives. I believe that he will. Now, I don't know who in the room this message was for. It's possible that the Lord just placed it on my heart for me and me alone, but honestly, I don't think that that's the case. I believe that some of you here may be in a sort of waiting period in your life. You may have a desire in your heart. You may have a dream that the Lord gave you years ago that you're not seeing come together. Or you may be in some sort of situation financially or emotionally or physically. You may be stuck in some sticky situation and not really see the end. Maybe in this season you're frustrated or you're discouraged or you're even doubting that God's going to come through at all. And if that's you, then I really encourage you now to just take some time. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to this message. So as my mom plays the piano for a little while, I encourage each of you to find a place around the room where you can be comfortable just getting with God. If you feel comfortable walking around the room and praying, that's okay with me. If you feel most comfortable staying in your seats and praying to yourself, that's fine too. Or you can come up to the altars. Whatever you are most comfortable with, I feel that it is so important to give every single one of you the opportunity to take time to reflect on this and to spend time with the Lord responding. Whether you feel like you needed this word because it was encouraging to you, just a reminder that God's going to come through, or whether you just need to know, you need to spend time with the Lord and you need to know that he is going to come through. I don't know what your situation is, but if you're here today and something I said spoke to you directly and you would say, today was for me, I needed to hear something that you said today, then I urge you to spend time alone with the Lord for the next few minutes, speaking to him about what's on your heart. So while my mom plays, we're going to spend some time doing that now.